If it's in a word or it's in a look, you can't get rid of the Babadook, Dook, Dook. Hello Internet, it's only me, and today's review is the excellent Australian horror movie, The Babadook. A horror film that has garnered some excellent reviews, and also maybe as a victim of some of those reviews, quite a lot of people who say simply, it's just not scary, which is fine. Opinions on all movies, all art, is subjective, so these people aren't wrong. I suspect some of those people who didn't get on with the movie or didn't find it scary enough were perhaps going in expecting some sort of Insidious kind of affair, because both films have a family terrorized by spectral creatures hiding in the shadows and the corners, looming over beds. Where Insidious comes from the quiet, quiet, bang school of cinema, what I like to call sitting on the piano school of cinema, and looks lavish, and true enough, some of the visuals are scary and horrifying, but it's very difficult for me to get on with a film where the soundtrack is continually telling me when I should be scared. This movie, although it shares some of the same visual cues as Insidious, is a different proposition altogether, in my opinion, and I actually think it's richer and ultimately more affecting. A lot of the things in this film have stayed with me for a number of days since I've seen it. So, in a completely spoiler-free way, we'll just touch briefly on the setup of the movie, but I assume if you're watching this, you kind of already know what it's about. It follows a grief-stricken mother, still mourning the loss of her husband, who died in a car accident 6 years previously, while she was in labour with her son, and they were on the way to the hospital for her to give birth. So she's now stuck with her 6-year-old son on the cusp of his 7th birthday, and he's very much a troubled child, or a trouble child, as some people like to label them. Very obviously traumatised by the lack of a father and the knowledge that of how his father died. And one of the ways this boy's problems manifests itself is a continuing belief in monsters and that they're real. And one night, when Mum's tucking him up to bed and reading him a bedtime story, he gets to choose the book, and he pulls a book down from the shelf that she's never seen before, called The Babadook. And as soon as that story is read, Mr. Babadook comes a-knocking. Now, if you've seen any other of my reviews, I'm thinking specifically of the review a little further down for Thanatomorphose, you will know that I love it, love it, when horror is used as a lens through which to observe very real and very real life terrors, fears and taboos. And this movie explores one doozy of a taboo. I'm going to talk briefly about parenthood and motherhood, a situation that I know absolutely nothing about, so take everything I'm about to say with a pinch of salt, because I know not whereof I speak. But it strikes me that new motherhood especially, and this is where I think there's a big gender imbalance. Mothers are supposed to instantly bond with their children. They're supposed to be a natural love. It's supposed to flow freely and come naturally. And what society as a whole very, very rarely talks about is very real situations for some women and men who simply do not bond with their children. and are left unable to communicate that feeling, and I would imagine are made to feel like there's something wrong with them. They must look around at other relationships and other mothers and children and fathers and children and think, well, why? What's wrong with me? What's missing? What is lacking? Also, what's not talked about is something that I strongly suspect every parent has experienced in the long, dark night when the child simply won't go to sleep and continues crying and crying and crying. And I imagine it's very common for fleeting thoughts of wanting to shut them up. Very dark thoughts that come in and go out. And unfortunately, if you see the headlines with some people, those thoughts come in and they don't go out. I don't imagine parenthood for 1 second is an easy proposition at all. And in our society, we make it out to be the ultimate state of rapture, blessing, and fulfillment. This film minds the very dark but very real flip side of that experience, and boy, is this a corker of a film. Much less Insidious or The Conjuring, this film has much more in common, much more of a genetic link to something like We Need to Talk About Kevin, which deals in a different way with a similar subject matter. My overriding impression while I was watching The Babadook was of The Shining. If you remember the fantastic scene in The Shining where Jack is just sat on the bed staring off into space, sort of half comatose, not there, and little Danny walks into the room and stands in front of him. If you remember that scene, Dad? Yes, son. You would never hurt Mummy and me, would you? Well, no, son. That whole tense, uneasy scene, which exactly plays out, well, what are we looking at? We're looking at a small boy speaking to his father, and the father's telling the boy that he loves him, and the boy's telling the father that he loves him, and it's just wrong, because there's this veneer of this relationship and what it's supposed to be, and we know it's twisted and wrong, and it's going wrong, and we know that something bad is going to happen. This film is like that scene stretched out and mined over about 90 minutes. And if you go into it wanting this film to be about something rather than just jumpy scares, boo, it's a ghost, then that ratcheting of the tension will get under your skin and start twisting your stomach. And ultimately it's what the movie's about, and it's scary as hell. One of the great tests I put to horror movies with brains is, would this work as a movie if you completely strip out the horror element? This would still be a horrific, uneasy, queasy, nail-biting movie, watching this relationship between mother and son play out. The fact that Mr. Babadook is in the mix just tips it over the edge, and after the cut we are going to talk about the demon of the film, again with no spoilers. Mr. Babadook himself is mostly glimpsed, silhouette, or mostly in shadow form, and you can Google pictures of him. Walt Disney said that one of the keys to his character designs should be that they're memorable in silhouette, so that you've got the Mickey Mouse ears, the 3 circles and things like that. Mr. Babadook is the perfect exemplar of that, with his top hat, long overcoat and pointy fingers. He is a visual reference to films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Max Schreck in Nosferatu. There are a few scenes in this where the writer-director pays specific homage to that type of movie and the beginnings of horror cinema. This is a very cine-literate film, and even though it's a colour film, the colour palette in it has rich dark shadows. Sometimes it's washed with blue, so at times it's very German expressionistic, and Mr. Babadook himself is a very scary proposition. The question, though, is what is Mr. Babadook? Is it a coincidence that Babadook is an anagram of a bad book, considering that's how he's first introduced to us? Is Mr. Babadook the son, as seen through the eyes of his mother? Is Mr. Babadook an external representation of the mother's overwhelming and unconquerable grief and depression? I know where I come down, and I'm not going to say on this video, because this is a film that asks you to ask those questions yourself and decide for yourself. I will say this though, with regard to what Mr. Babadook is. I will ask one question. It doesn't give away anything in the film at all, but it's one you might want to ask yourself. What is in the basement at the beginning of the film, and what is in the basement at the end of the film? And are those two things the same thing? I've read some reactions from people online who have said that the kid in this just annoys the hell out of them, and I couldn't enjoy the movie because the kid was so annoying. If you're going to show a woman who is so at the end of her tether and unable to cope with the demands of parenthood and a very, very demanding son, you damn well better make sure that you can understand where she's coming from by having this son at times be incredibly annoying and frustrating, and for you to be squirming in your seat thinking, I just can't stand this, I just want him to shut the fuck up. Because if you don't put your audience in the shoes of the mother in this film, then you will have failed in the story you're trying to tell. This film does not fail. This child is at turns incredibly trying and frustrating and anger-making, and at times very warm and sweet and loving and scared and vulnerable and strong. The child's performance is amazing. The actress who plays the mother, who shoulders most of the heavy lifting in this film, again, if you're going to depict a woman who harbours the darkest thoughts, possibly suicide, possibly infanticide, possibly both, and she's your hero, you have to have a performance that takes you along with her and keeps you on her side, even though it goes to these terrible, terrible places. And again, this performance is something to behold. There's a portion just into the first third of the film where you may start getting frustrated with the setup. Why doesn't she just, why doesn't someone just ride that out? It's a very small wave. This film is creepy, scary, heartrending. Some people feel cheated by the ending, and I think it really depends on where you fall about what Mr. Babadook is. Because of my views on Mr. Babadook, the creature, I find the ending amazingly satisfying. Other people whose opinions I've read online who have a differing opinion on what Mr. Babadook is, think that the ending's a cop-out. Oh, it's not a cop-out. It's not a cop-out at all. After all, you can't get rid of Mr. Babadook.